Today I want to talk about quitting podcasts, and this is going to cover both quitting a podcast that you co-host with someone and just quitting your own show that you do either with guests or solo episodes or, in the case of the podcast life, I do both. But I'm going to start with quitting podcasts that you host with other people because there's a different conversation that has to be had there. Is the show going to continue on without you? And is the show something that you started and you invited other people to co-host the show with you? There are a couple different dynamics there. So I'm going to use the very first podcast I did as an example. That podcast was called Misaligned, and I was approached by a website called Modern Vinyl to start the podcast. And I had two co-hosts to start that show. And over the years, the co-host that I started with ended up not doing the podcast for various reasons, but because I was the person who was also editing the show, I was able to just find someone else who was able to fill in the co-host spot for the first co-host that left. And then when the second co-host left, the two of us just continued on without having a third host. And then there came a point in time about 100 episodes into the podcast where I just wasn't listening to as much music as I was before, as my interest developed and as I started actually doing podcasting as a job, editing other people's podcasts. So there was just a not disinterest in music at that point, but I just wasn't keeping up with it enough to justify me continuing to do the podcast. And since I was the one who edited it, I had a conversation with my co-host and, we just mutually agreed to do a final episode of the show. We wrapped it up. We obviously let Modern Vinyl know as well what was going on, and everyone mutually parted ways. I think it's very important that when you quit a show, especially if it's a show that you like doing and you like the people you're doing it with, that you just have a honest conversation with yourself about why you are quitting the show. So the show just ended and I moved on to the next thing, which I had also done a sports podcast with a co-host, and that ultimately didn't work out because we really honestly just tried to cover too many sports. It wasn't specific enough. Sports schedules are crazy when you're trying to cover 4 or 5 different sports, and there's just so much going on. Scheduling is often the thing that kind of gets in the way. And I know that I talked to a previous guest on the show, Travis Newton, about this, and him and his co-host Drew have a set night of the week where they record. And I think that is a fantastic way to just have this dedicated schedule for your podcast instead of trying to be like, okay, well, this week we're going to record on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Next week, though, we have to record on Friday at 4 p.m. And it just sort of makes things a little more hectic. And now I want to talk about quitting podcasts that you do yourself, whether that is solo or with guests. And I have quit 2 podcasts, Welcome to Geekdom and Chat Cemetery. I did have another podcast in the Guidance of Geekdom, but that was intentionally a mini-series. So I'm not talking about, this podcast was only, 12 episodes and then we were done with it. But with Welcome to Geekdom, I did that podcast for 300 episodes. Chat Cemetery was somewhere in the 150 to 175 range. I was doing both of those shows at the same time at one point in time, and both of them were weekly. And with one of them being a Stephen King podcast where I had to read massive books and watch 2 or 3 seasons of TV shows sometimes just to do a single episode, it was a lot of content that I was trying to consume all at once. I had a bump in freelance work, and when your freelance work is podcasting, sometimes it is hard to want to keep one, let alone 2 weekly podcasts going, which is a huge reason why this show is not a weekly show and why I am alternating between solo episodes and guest episodes. So with Chat Cemetery, things were a little different though, because I technically accomplished my goal with that podcast. My goal was to read and watch everything that was Stephen King related. So I read his books, with the exception of, I want to say, a couple of nonfiction books. I had caught up with everything that I could, but those I just ran out of steam, ran out of ideas. Like I said, with Chat Cemetery, I did technically accomplish my goal, but I never thought of any ideas to fill in the gaps once I was caught up. So I was like, oh, maybe I could do episodes on specific characters. And in the end, I was like, there are other Stephen King podcasts that are kind of already doing those things that I would potentially be doing as additional episodes. And I was like, you know what? I did what I set out to do. That is fine. It ran for well over 100 episodes. Welcome to Geekdom ran for 300 episodes. Not all things have to go on forever. And that was why I was like, okay, it is fine. I'm okay with quitting these podcasts. I think it's just really important to know when to quit something. And it took me a while to get to that place. It took me time to learn that quitting didn't necessarily mean I failed. I had a lot of fun doing those podcasts, but sometimes things change, and that is fine. So I'm hoping this helps some of you if you've been worried about quitting a podcast or worried about whether or not you can start another one. You definitely can start another one. And I am now on my 6th podcast. So this is definitely proof of that. You can just keep going, keep trying different ideas until you find the one that really, really makes you excited and really just sticks with you. And if that eventually fades away, you can wrap that project up too and just move on to the next one. You know, it's kind of like being a novelist, I guess. You have one idea, you write about it, you wrap it up, you move on to the next one. So I hope this helps. And if you guys want to learn more about creating a podcast trailer for whatever podcast you start next, you should definitely check out my episode with Ariel Nissenblatt. It has a lot of great information on how you can do that and what you should include in your trailer.